So today we're going to be having a look at microphones and their properties, why you might choose one microphone over the other to record with. So we should all know that there are two different categories that we can generally divide microphones into. The first being dynamic, meaning that it doesn't require an external power source to work, and the other one being condenser, which means that it does need an external power source to work. A good example of a dynamic microphone would be a Shure SM57, which we do have in the studio. And a good example of a condenser would be the AKG C414, which we also do have in the studio. However, there's usually a lot more thought put into choosing a microphone than you might actually think than just dynamic or condenser. So for example, condensers can pick up subtle nuances in a sound, especially in high frequencies. They are a lot more sensitive as well, so that means that you wouldn't necessarily have to push the gain on your interface as high to get a good signal. Also, generally speaking, condenser microphones have a flatter frequency response, which means that they pick up sounds across the frequency spectrum a lot more evenly. These condenser microphones also require phantom power, which dynamic microphones do not require. So condenser microphones, the properties that they have make them ideal for recording things such as voice. I'm using a condenser microphone right now because it picks up those subtle nuances in a voice. Moderately loud acoustic instruments, so things like an acoustic guitar, and also things like drum cymbals, which have a lot of high frequency information. Dynamic microphones, on the other hand, have some properties that make them more suited to other applications. For example, they can withstand a much higher SPL, which stands for sound pressure level, which means that you can put them in front of things like kick drums and don't have to worry about them distorting quite as much as a condenser microphone. They generally have a very solid build quality, which means that if you ever see singers live on stage that whirl their microphones around their head, or if you drop them, they probably won't break. I wouldn't recommend trying to break them, but yeah, they probably won't break as easily as a condenser microphone. And also, they don't require phantom power as an external power source. So you could plug these microphones straight into a cheaper system that may not have phantom power for each channel. Now, these are some of the things that you keep in mind when you are selecting a microphone, but is that all? You got to think that there are thousands upon thousands of microphones out there of different price ranges, shapes and colors and sizes. So why would somebody choose one microphone over the other? Often the reason behind people selecting one microphone over the other refers to two certain factors, those being the frequency response of the microphone and also the polar pattern of the microphone. So frequency response simply refers to how sensitive a microphone is or isn't to certain frequencies. You can read these diagrams as the vertical axis referring to the amplitude of the frequency and the horizontal axis referring to the frequency itself, so that would be measured in hertz or kilohertz. You can see that down at the bottom. So here we have two frequency response charts of two different microphones. These are both dynamic microphones. The one on the left is the Audix D6 and the one on the right is the Shure SM57. So again, these are both dynamic microphones. So the way that they function is technically speaking very similar. However, the sound they produce is wildly different. This is all due to the areas of the frequency spectrum where they are sensitive, and also the areas where they are not sensitive. So these frequency responses attributed to these microphones are most probably not accidents, and neither are they better or worse in any way. It just makes them more suitable for certain scenarios. For example, you might want to use the D6 on a kick drum, as kick drums generally have some nasty sounding frequencies that the D6 isn't as sensitive to, and that would be around the 500 Hz area, so they have a little dip around there. And also there's quite a nice boost to the low end, which brings out the punch of the kick drum around 80 Hz. You may also want to use the SM57 for a live vocalist, as there's a slight boost around 2 kHz, which is where the human speech sits in the frequency spectrum. Also, there's kind of a less pronounced low end as well. So the next thing we're going to look at is something called the proximity effect. So if you take a closer look at this frequency response chart, you'll notice that there are dotted lines with small writing next to them. This indicates that a bass boost will occur at certain distances, as you can see that has things like 3mm, 25mm and 51mm. This is known as the proximity effect. The proximity effect occurs when you move a microphone with a figure of 8 or cardioid pattern closer to the sound source. Something worth noting that this doesn't affect omnidirectional microphones due to the way that they're built. This effect can be useful for making people sound like they're bass boosted. For example, if you want a kind of Barry White kind of sound to your voice, or if you want a fatter, warmer sounding guitar tone, you can move the microphone closer to the amplifier or the guitar. As a sound engineer, you should be aware of this effect and pay attention to the distance of your microphone to a sound source to either raise the prominence of this effect or reduce the prominence of this effect. So let's hear this effect in action if possible. So first of all, I'm going to record the guitar about 12 inches away from the microphone. And then I'm going to move it closer. So try and get a sort of mental snapshot of what the low end frequencies of the guitar sound like before we move on to the next one. Now I'm going to half the distance down to 6 inches and see what happens to the low frequencies of the guitar. As long as you're listening on earphones, you should have noticed that there was quite a significant bass boost. So the other important thing that sound engineers will think about when they're choosing a microphone is its polar pattern. So polar patterns, in very simple terms, determine which direction the microphone is most sensitive and which direction, if any, it is least sensitive. It's always very important to think about both aspects of this. So for example, here is one of the most common polar patterns, cardioid. We can get a few useful pieces of information from this chart. We can see that directly ahead of the microphone is the most sensitive area, as there's no reduced sound level from this area. Going slightly off to the sides, however, the microphone becomes less sensitive, and this trend carries on until you reach about 180 degrees, where it reaches a complete null point. The Shure SM57 has this polar pattern. It's quite often regarded as one of the best microphones to record a snare drum with, not just because it can be pointed at the snare drum and pick up all the sound in front of it, but also because that null area on the back side of it can be used to reduce the sound of the hi-hat. This feature is quite important for modern drum multitracking, as most drummers position the snare and hi-hat next to each other, which often leads to bleed between the two sound sources. Using a cardioid polar pattern can help with this as long as you position the microphone correctly. Also, with the proximity effect that we mentioned earlier, the sound engineer can choose whether they want to get a really deep sounding snare drum or a brighter, snappier sounding snare drum. Here are some other common polar patterns. Can you think of how these might be used?